Okay, welcome back, everyone. Please take your seats, the massive crowd. Join us. Welcome back. It's now 3 p.m. Evelyn, do we have a quorum present?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We maintain quorum by having all 5 members present. And I just wanted to review some language selection logistics for today's hybrid workshop. The DTSC hosted workshop is being held both in person and remotely via phone and Zoom. For those joining us in Zoom, please select your preferred language option, either English or Spanish, by clicking the interpretation icon on your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see the icon, you may need to update your Zoom application. In-person participants who prefer to participate in Spanish can obtain headsets from our interpretation table at the far left of the room, and a staff person will assist you. Additionally, if you're in person and following along on Zoom, please ensure your device's speaker and microphone are muted. If anyone experiences connectivity issues with Zoom, you can call in for either English or Spanish, and the phone numbers will be provided to you in the Zoom chat. And they're also posted on the board's websites. So now I will kick it off back to you, Chair Russell.
Okay, thank you, Evelyn. I'd now like to introduce our executive.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Can I ask for one of the interpreters to repeat those instructions for us in Spanish for Jeanette?
Buenas tardes a todos. Ahora vamos a hacer una revisión de los artículos de logística. La reunión de hoy está siendo híbrida y se está llevando a cabo en persona y de manera remota vía teléfono y Zoom. Para aquellos que están con nosotros en Zoom, por favor seleccione su lenguaje de preferencia. Tenemos la opción inglés o español. Puede hacer clic en el icono de interpretación en su barra de Zoom en la parte de abajo de su pantalla. Si usted no ve el icono, usted necesita actualizar su aplicación. También en las personas que están en el auditorio, quien prefiera participar en español, puede obtener sus audífonos en la mesa de interpretación que está en la parte izquierda del auditorio y una persona del equipo le asistirá. Adicionalmente, si usted está siguiendo la reunión a través de Zoom, por favor asegúrese que tenga los dispositivos apagados y el micrófono esté apagado. La next slide, please. Si alguien está experimentando alguna conectividad o algún problema con Zoom, tú puedes llamar ya sea en inglés o español y los números serán proveídos en la pantalla. También los hemos puesto en la cajita de chat. También serán posteados en la página web. Gracias. Back to you, Courtney.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. I will now kick it off to Chair Rizzo to begin introduction for this workshop.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. Actually, I'm going to turn it over to Executive Officer Swathi Sharma.
Great, thank you so much. So we are, as you all know, based off of the slide and the earlier directions, we're transitioning to a workshop. This is the G&H fee regulations workshop that is hosted by DTSC. And today we have a number of presenters: Peter Garcia, Environmental Program Manager; Josephine Lee, Staff Service Analyst; Taylor Gross, Senior Hazardous Substance Engineer; Spencer Eberhard, Environmental Scientist; and Catherine Grant, Fiscal Policy and Process Improvement Manager. And I will now kick it off to Peter Garcia. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for participating in our Generation and Handling Fee Regulations workshop. My name is Peter Garcia. I'm an environmental program manager with the Department of Toxic Substances Control, Hazardous Waste Management Program. Our goal today is to present regulatory concepts we are developing with respect to generation and handling fees, and to receive feedback from participants that will be considered when developing the regulations. Please note that this workshop is intended to inform the proposed regulation text that we are developing, and that final regulatory language will go through a formal public notice. I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items for our workshop. We'll have 4 presenters on topics that I will preview in a minute. After each speaker, we'll have a 10-minute period to field comments and questions in between panelist presentations. This will be the opportunity for public feedback. We will take comments from our live audience at the end of each topic, and we will field comments from our virtual participants at the end of all presentations. Our live audience will have 2 minutes to provide their comment or ask their question. Our virtual participants can submit feedback or questions using the form that can be accessed with the QR code on the screen. They will be directed to our staff who will be monitoring the comments and questions. At the end of all our presentations, we will respond to questions and comments submitted by our virtual audience. Please note that depending on the volume of comments received, we may not be able to respond to all of them within the allotted amount of time, but be assured that we will review all of them and consider them in our development of the regulations. The same QR code can be used after today to submit feedback up until November 1st, 2024. This slide we are viewing also has the web address to our fee regulations webpage, which has the materials that are being presented in our workshop today. This next slide contains our general timeline for adopting the emergency regulations. We plan on public noticing the proposed regulations on January 8th, 2025, with a goal of having them in place by January 27th, 2025. The generation and handling fee was established in 2021 by SB 158, which consolidated multiple fees into one flat per ton rate. The G&H fee applies to all hazardous waste generators that generate 5 or more tons of hazardous waste at a site in a calendar year and applies to both manifested and unmanifested waste. The Board of Environmental Safety annually sets the fee rates at a level equal to the department's authorized expenditures, with a modest reserve of up to 10% of expenditures. The fee rate is calculated based on the amount of revenues required to fund the department's operations and the amount of hazardous waste generated in the prior calendar year that is subject to the fee. The fee is administered and collected by the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. DTSC's generation data is used by CDTFA in the administration and collection of these fees. Within the first year of implementation, DTSC identified a significant revenue shortfall in the G&H fee. So as a result, DTSC conducted a root cause analysis of the G&H shortfall and identified 3 major contributing factors. DTSC and CDTFA data was insufficient to administer, collect, and oversee the fee. For example, hazardous waste data was unable to be reconciled with CDTFA's return information. Secondly, generators were not paying all of their fees. DTSC found that 20% of the hazardous waste generated, which was subject to the G&H fee, was not being paid or reported in CDTFA fee returns. And lastly, some generators have broadly and inappropriately applied exemptions to the waste. As a result of the fee collection challenges, SB 156 was enacted in July 2024 to implement solutions to the administration, collection, and enforcement of the G&H fee. Specifically, SB 156 clarified and consolidated a number of the statutory fee exemptions. It established escalating penalties for late payments and returns, provided emergency rulemaking authority for fee-related activities, authorized the development of an exemption review process, and authorized the department to assess penalties for failure to comply with the reporting requirements. DTSC has developed regulatory concepts surrounding 4 topics that you will hear today. The topics include the annual hazardous waste verification process, clarification of exemption criteria, the process for reviewing claimed exemptions, and a proposed penalty assessment framework for noncompliance with reporting requirements. Our primary purpose today is to present these concepts and to solicit feedback for consideration as we develop the regulations. We have 4 DTSC panelists with us today. I'll introduce them once again. We have Ms. Josephine Lee, a staff services analyst who will discuss the annual hazardous waste verification process. We have Mr. Taylor Gross, a senior hazardous substances engineer who will discuss clarification of the exemption criteria. We also have Mr. Spencer Eberhard, an environmental scientist who will discuss the process for exemptions. And we have Ms. Catherine Grant, our fiscal policy and process improvement manager, who will discuss the proposed penalty assessment framework for noncompliance with reporting requirements. Ms. Lee will start us off by presenting the annual hazardous waste verification concepts, and I will turn it over to Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Peter. As earlier mentioned, my name is Josephine, and I am an analyst in the Hazardous Waste Management Program. I will be discussing the proposed regulations for the annual Hazardous Waste Verification Questionnaire, also known as EVQ, which is short for the Electronic Verification Questionnaire. Next slide, please. The verification questionnaire is required by California Health and Safety Code 25205.16. It is conducted to verify the accuracy of the information associated with the ID number. Required filers must complete the questionnaire related to hazardous waste activities. We will discuss the scope of the required filers in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Part of the proposed regulations is to define handler for the purposes of this report. For the purposes of EVQ, handler means any person that generates, transports, offers for transport, treats, stores, or disposes of hazardous waste. Slide, please. Health and Safety Code 25205.16 states, each entity issued an identification number shall provide or verify the information specified in paragraphs 1 to 9. Part of the proposed regulations is to make specific what the scope of required filers is. DTSC is proposing that reporting is required for any person who was a hazardous waste handler in the prior calendar year that meets any of the following criteria. If they had an ID number in California that was active at any time in the previous calendar year, and or if they generated, transported, treated, stored, or disposed of hazardous waste in the previous calendar year. Next slide, please. The proposed exceptions for reporting are ID numbers for sites on federally recognized tribal land and occupants of households that only generate household hazardous waste. For example, a homeowner that had asbestos remediation done. Next slide. Let's go over the reporting timeline. Health and Safety Code 25205.16 states that this report is used to annually verify information relating to handlers. DTSC proposes that handlers who meet the reporting requirements shall submit their report by March 15th of each year. This date is proposed for the Fiscal Policy Unit to meet the Board of Environmental Safety's timelines for fee rate setting. Because we understand this process is new for some filers, we are considering pushing the deadline slightly for 2025 to give handlers a little extra time for filing. Next slide, please. We're looking to clarify what is required to be reported. This will include handler information, including business name, federal employer identification number, California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, GNH fee account number, number of employees, and North American Industry Classification System Code. This will also include owner information, contact information, and ID number information, such as site address. A majority of these are already specified in statute, and we are proposing to also require the operator type, such as if the handler is a government agency or a private business structure, which legally defines the category type of an organization, such as an LLC or sole proprietorship, and active or inactive status of the ID number. Next slide, please. Health and Safety Code 25205.16A8 also requires handlers to report an identification of any of the following hazardous waste activities in which the firm or organization is engaged, including A, generation, B, transportation, and C, on-site treatment, storage, or disposal. DTSC is proposing to make specific what should be reported regarding generation, transportation, and on-site treatment, storage, or disposal activities. We'll go over these specific activities in the next few slides. Next slide, please. We are proposing that generators shall report or verify the following for each site in terms of their prior calendar year's hazardous waste activity: the total quantity of hazardous waste manifested, the total quantity of unmanifested wastes, such as treated wood waste and applicable variances, the transporter ID numbers, and total quantity of hazardous waste managed using consolidated manifesting procedures, and any claiming of G&H fee exemptions and deductions. Next slide, please. For transporters, we are proposing that they report or verify the following for each site for their prior calendar year's hazardous waste activities: total quantity of hazardous waste manifested, and the manifest tracking numbers, generator ID numbers, and total quantity of hazardous waste per manifest managed using consolidated manifesting procedures. Next slide. And finally, we are proposing that on-site treatment, storage, or disposal facilities report or verify the following for each site for their prior calendar year's hazardous waste activities: the total quantity of hazardous waste manifested, the total quantity of unmanifested wastes, such as treated wood waste and applicable variances, and any claiming of G&H fee exemptions and deductions. Next slide. Now we'd like to take some feedback on the following questions. Other feedback and questions are also welcome, but we'd like to especially focus on these. You can feel free to ask in person or use the QR code that's on the screen to submit your feedback. The first question is, what are some ways DTSC can help stakeholders with reporting compliance? As a background, EVQ currently pulls in hazardous waste tracking system data for all filers and transporter quarterly report data for transporters that request it to make the reporting process more efficient. The next question we have is, what feedback is there regarding a March 15th due date? I'll turn it over to Peter for in-person questions and feedback.
Thank you, Josephine. So now's the time that we'll accept comments or questions on the environmental verification questionnaire from our live audience. For our virtual audience, please use the QR code on this slide to submit your comments or questions, which will be addressed in the general response session by our panel at the end of all presentations. Do we have anyone in the audience that would like to speak? Okay. Seeing none, we will pause for a couple of minutes to allow those in the virtual audience to submit their questions or comments through the QR code, and then we'll resume with our next segment of the presentation. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So next, we're going to hear from Mr. Taylor Gross on the exemption criteria clarification. Taylor?
Thanks, Peter. Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor Gross. I am a senior hazardous substances engineer with DTSC. And today I want to highlight the regulations that we're planning to write to clarify the applicability of the exemption criteria for a couple of the exemptions that exist in statute. Next slide. So here on the slide, you see the 10 exemptions from the generation and handling fee, as well as one deduction that exists in statute. We presented on these before, but I just want to go over them here to identify them, and then I'll cover which ones we're planning on clarifying in regs. So the 10 exemptions are the governmental response exemption, the household hazardous waste collection center exemption, the exemption for load checking programs, the exemption for household do-it-yourself for used oil, waste that is recycled and used on site, waste that is generated and treated on site to be non-hazardous, universal waste, banned, unregistered, and outdated agricultural wastes which are submitted to a collection event, reusable soiled textile materials, natural disaster victim waste, and then the pass-through waste deduction. In our fee regulation webpage, you'll find the draft language of our regulatory clarifications. In this presentation, I just want to discuss those clarifications that we're going to be making and then respond to the inquiries that we continue to receive. The exemptions that we're going to clarify in regulations for that purpose will be limited to the governmental response exemption, the household hazardous waste collection center exemption, and the load checking program exemption. And we'll also cover the pass-through waste deduction. Additionally, the regulations will move the natural disaster victims waste fee exemption to the regulatory section that has these other fee exemptions to consolidate everything into one section. There are no changes being made to that natural disaster victim exemption, though. Next slide. So before we get into the exemptions and what wastes are not subject to the fee, I want to cover what waste is subject to the fee. Health and Safety Code Section 25205.5 requires that every generator of hazardous waste, which generates at one site 5 tons or more of hazardous waste, is required to pay the fee for each ton of hazardous waste that they generate. For the purposes of the generation and handling fee, the definition of generator, which exists in Health and Safety Code 25205.1, is here on the screen. It states that a generator means any person who generates hazardous waste at an individual site commencing after 1988, which includes a person identified on a manifest. This is in line with the existing definition of generator in regulation. However, because this definition provides an example using manifests, we've received inquiries relating to a waste stream being paid on twice. And so we want to clear that up in regulations. Next slide. So to clarify that definition, we plan to state that only the original generator of the waste is subject to the fee. This applies to specific situations where the same waste might be generated more than once within its lifespan. And while that sounds confusing, there are some scenarios that we'll get to later where there will be 2 different points of generation, but the waste is fundamentally basically the same. It doesn't change a whole lot. In providing this clarification, we will also clearly state that if a new waste is generated, like in a situation where residuals of a treatment process are generated, then that new point of generation and waste is subject to the fee. Next slide. So the first exemption we want to cover is the governmental response exemption. So this is the exemption that exists in 25174.8.1 A1A. I know that's a lot. This exemption says that hazardous waste that results when a government agency takes a removal or remedial action or a corrective action to address a release of hazardous substances caused by a person other than the governmental agency that takes that removal or remedial action is not subject to the fee if both of the following conditions are met. They took immediate action and there was an imminent and substantial threat. I'll note that the government agency also cannot be a responsible party in that scenario. Next slide. So we want to connect the terms removal and remedial action for the purposes of hazardous waste management with the same meanings they have for our site mitigation program by defining that they have the same meaning as in Health and Safety Code 78-125 and 78-135. Removal action is defined there in 78-135 as the cleanup or removal of released hazardous substances from the environment or the taking of other actions as may be necessary to prevent, minimize, or mitigate damage that may otherwise result from a release or threatened release. Remedial action is defined in 78-125 as those actions that are consistent with a permanent remedy that are taken instead of or in addition to removal actions in the event of a release or threatened release of hazardous substance into the environment. In addition to making these connections, we also want to clarify what is meant by immediate action necessary and imminent and substantial threat of release. Immediate action necessary means that the government agency responded in a timely and correct manner upon learning about a release of hazardous substance. This does not include when a governmental agency failed to perform their due diligence to discover the waste if it meets all the other provisions for this exemption. Imminent and substantial threat means that the hazardous substance either is a release or is reasonable to expect that this hazardous substance, if not removed or remedied, will lead to a release which causes a hazardous contamination of the property. Next slide. So one additional clarification I will point out regarding this exemption is that Health and Safety Code 25174.8.1D provides that the term governmental agency includes a contractor that's authorized to act on behalf of the governmental agency and who uses the governmental agency's EPA ID number. DTSC plans to clarify that the term contractor only refers to an entity that is contracted specifically for the purposes of managing a hazardous substance at a government-owned site on behalf of that governmental agency and who meets all the other requirements for the governmental exemption. This means that entities who have entered into a contract with a governmental agency for some other purpose are not considered a contractor. Next slide. The second exemption, which we'll provide further detail on in regulation, is the household hazardous waste collection facility exemption. This exemption is in 25174.8.1A2, and it states that hazardous waste generated by a public agency, which results from the operation of a hazardous waste collection facility, is not subject to the generation and handling fee. Next slide. So the clarification we want to make here is the phrase resulting from the operation of a household hazardous waste collection facility. We want to clarify that that means only the actions taken by that public agency in accordance with their permit by rule authorization. This means that waste that is not generated as a result of their authorization is not exempt. An example of waste that would not be exempt under this provision is hazardous waste that is generated by a household hazardous waste collection facility when they're constructing a new building, even if that new building will facilitate a more efficient operation of their collection facility. This waste is not being generated as a result of their permit by rule authorizations, and therefore it's not subject to the fee. Or sorry, it's not subject to the exemption. It's still subject to the fee. I want to note that this exemption is an example where the original generator is subject to the fee, but any subsequent generators are not. Next slide. The third exemption we want to clarify with our regs is the load checking program exemption. Health and Safety Code Section 25174.8.1A3 provides that hazardous waste disposed of or submitted for disposal or treatment that is generated by a person and is discovered and separated from solid waste as part of a load checking program is not subject to the fee. Next slide. DTSC wants to clarify the term load checking program to mean a process of separating hazardous waste at a solid waste handling facility due to a permitted or regulatory requirement on that process. In other words, if the solid waste handling facility is not authorized to accept the hazardous waste, but it's discovered in their incoming waste stream, they're not considered to be the generator for purposes of the generation and handling fee. However, DTSC wants to limit this exemption to solid waste handling facilities that are implementing reasonable forms of operational procedures to minimize the amount of hazardous waste that is received at their site. This can look like agreements with feeder yards, inspection prior to acceptance, or any number of activities depending on the solid waste management facility. Next slide. The final clarification we plan to make in regulation that we want to discuss today is the pass-through waste deduction. This deduction exists in Health and Safety Code 25205.5A4. So there's a lot of text on the screen here, so I'm not going to read all of it, but essentially the hazardous waste facilities that pay an annual facility fee may deduct from their hazardous waste liability the waste that is stored, bulked, and transferred through the location of the hazardous waste facility en route to another destination facility as specified in statute. This is another example where the original generator of the waste is subject to the fee and subsequent generators are not. Next slide. So again, I want to say that we're clarifying this in regulation because we've received several questions on what this section means. We want to clarify that the deduction applies only to generators who stored, bulked, and transferred the waste with no treatment taking place. This is in line with the EPA Management Method Code H141. DTSC will also clarify that the deduction does not apply to residuals of hazardous waste treatment operations. These residuals will still be subject to the generation and handling fee. Next slide. As we continue to present, you can provide questions or comments on the draft language using this QR code on the screen. Please do so. We want to hear from you as to whether these clarifications as described are represented in our draft language. We also want input on what factors influence response times for government agency responses. What factors are taken into account when determining how to respond to a release? Additionally, we want to know what operational procedures currently exist to limit the amount of incoming hazardous waste into a solid waste collection program. And are there any other regulatory considerations for pass-through waste that we should take into consideration? With that, I will hand it back over to Peter to open the question and answer period.
Thank you, Taylor. So one thing I wanted to mention is that please note that the draft regulation text can be accessed on our fees website that's been provided on our slides. We're now going to accept comments or questions regarding the exemption criteria clarification from our live audience. But before we do so, I wanted to clarify for our virtual audience, what we're going to do is, if you can please, once again, submit any comments or questions through the QR code that's provided on the slides. And those comments and questions are going to staff that we have working behind the scenes to account for those comments and questions. We're going to answer and respond to the comments and questions at the end of all of our presentations. We have 2 more presentations left. After that, we'll have a Q&A period for everyone who submitted their comments and questions online. So just wanted to clarify. Right now, we're just taking feedback from our live audience, and we'll be responding to everything everyone submits at the end of our all of our presentations. And as I mentioned, we may or may not be able to respond to all the questions and comments depending on how many we get, but please be assured that we are going to evaluate them as we look at developing the emergency regulations. So for now, we're going to go to our live audience to find out if anyone in the audience would like to speak on this particular topic. Okay, seeing none at this point, what we'll do, again, we'll pause for a couple minutes here so that all our virtual participants can use that QR code, access the comment form, and submit their comments and questions. And again, we will be responding to those at the end of all our presentations. So one other bit of information, I was informed that there may have been some confusion about the earlier QR code. So this QR code should be operable and you should be able to access the comment form by using this particular code. So we're going to go ahead and move on. If you can advance to the next slide, please. And what we'll do after this next presentation, there's a lot of material to cover in this next presentation. So we're going to take a 10-minute break so that we get a break in between presentations after Mr. Eberhard delivers his presentation. So with that, I'll introduce Spencer Eberhard, an environmental scientist with our hazardous waste management program. And Spencer is going to talk about the exemption review process. Spencer?
All right, hi. As Peter said, I'm Spencer Eberhard. I'm just gonna say it again, I'm an environmental scientist, and I'm going to be sharing about what we're working on with the exemption review process. And this is a new way for DTSC to verify that exemptions to the generation handling fee are accurate. So there's gonna be a fair amount of information here, and I'm gonna try to make it accessible. But one thing I wanna highlight is that prior to this workshop, we upload a handout on DTSC's fees regulations webpage. And that handout on that webpage relates to what I'll be presenting here, the exemption review process. As this is a new process, we want to provide a handout ahead of time so that people have time to contemplate the subject matter. We'll be posting a link to that fees webpage right now so that you can follow that link and see the handout. All right. So we strongly encourage you to check that handout out, but also on that webpage, it has additional supplementary information that relates to all the stuff that we're presenting here today. We will also continue to take feedback, such as to that QR code at the end of this presentation. All right. With that said, I can begin explaining this exemption review process. Next slide. Okay. So we're going to start here with Health and Safety Code on the slide 25205.5.3. And this statute was adopted with Senate Bill 156, and it's DTSC's authority to create this exemption review process. On this slide, there are words process and information in A and B. So there's two requirements saying that DTSC needs to develop a process for evaluating exemption claims, and B, the information a claimant is required to submit to the department. So these are key terms, and they're going to be how the regulations are structured. So let's go to the next slide, and I can explain how the regs are structured. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so the department proposes 2 sections be adopted for implementing exemption review. So for section 1 on the left, will be the review process. And this review process has 2 main parts to it. They are the department notification of generators and generator deadlines. On the right is the second section. It's record keeping. This is information that's going to be required to be provided. So from the statute, remember the information. This section is also kind of structured into 2 main parts. It's baseline information required for all exemptions, and then information required for specific exemptions. I will explain both of these regulatory concepts, but let's start with section 1, and we can see how the exemption review process actually works. So the steps. Next slide, please. So start with section 1, the exemption review process. This is the first section of regulations, and it'll be entirely contained within this section how the process works. In these slides, I will first explain the review process at a high level, and then I can go into detail on the generator notifications and then the generator deadlines, which work together so this whole process functions. So let's start with the overall process on the next slide. Okay, these are at the highest level the steps of the exemption review process in its current concepts. So it goes from top to bottom, 1, 2, and 3. There's 3 main steps. The general flow of the process is going to be at the top with 1. So this is how it starts. The department will notify some generators that claimed an exemption. And we're not going to notify all generators, just some of them that are chosen to be reviewed. And the department will request information from that generator that relates to their exemption. Next, then, is step 2, where the department will review that information that was obtained from the generator. Once that information is reviewed, we go to the final step, step 3. And in this final step, DTSC will send an evaluation to the generator and the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, CDTFA. And this evaluation that's sent out will be DTSC's determination on the validity of the exemption. So that's the process at the highest level. Let's go into the notification of generators and deadlines and how they fit into these steps. Next slide. Okay. During the steps of the exemption review process that we kind of just went through, there will be notifications that are mailed to the generator as well as sent by email as a courtesy. DTSC proposes regulations be sent out at all the following steps of the process. So 1, at the start, when DTSC requests information from a generator, a notification will accompany that request for information. 2, upon DTSC receiving that information, or if a generator requests additional time. We'll go into that a little more later, how that works. 3, if DTSC needs additional information from a generator. So this happens if DTSC obtains that initial bit of information but realizes as it's being reviewed, it's not enough to fully evaluate the exemption. When that happens, the department will notify the generators and ask for more information. And then lastly, a notification will be sent after DTSC conducts its exemption review, it's finished it, a notification will be sent with an evaluation of the exemption. This notification will be sent not just to the generators, but also CDTFA, and it will explain how we came to our conclusion. Each of these notifications roughly line up with those 3 steps of the process on that prior slide. So further information on these notifications can be seen in the handout that you can access from that link we posted in chat on the fees regulation webpage. It goes more in depth. And if you wish to know more and understand kind of these notifications better, strongly encourage you to check out that handout. So that's the notifications, how the department will notify generators. Now we can go into the second main concept of the process, deadlines. Next slide. Okay, so one of the main goals is to complete exemption review before the Board of Environmental Safety sets fee rates around July and then enacted in October. Without deadlines, DTSC would not be able to provide the board an accurate assessment of hazardous waste that is subject to the fee. And this matters because if many exemptions are claimed inaccurately, the fee rate will have to be set at a higher rate. And this is not equitable, as generators that do not claim exemptions inaccurately, well, then they have to pay more in fees because the fee rate's higher now. Because of these reasons, DTSC proposes setting regulations 3 main deadlines for generators so that this review process can proceed at a pace and to meet these goals. These deadlines are as follows on the slide. We'll start with 1, 30 calendar days for generators to provide information. So if you recall from the notifications, once the department notifies a generator asking for information, it will have 30 days to provide it, 30 calendar days. The next deadline would be 2, 15 calendar days if the generator requests a one-time extension period. If you recall from the last slide, we mentioned the department would notify the generator if the generator asks for additional time. Well, the generator can ask for a one-time extension period of 15 calendar days, and that would add on to that 30-day calendar day period. But this is a one-time extension. 3, the third deadline is 30 calendar days, and this is, again, the 30 calendar days if DTSC decides it needs additional information. So the information was provided the first time, but DTSC decided it needs more. So this would be another 30 days for the generator to provide that last bit of information. I want to highlight on the slide, though, those calendar days are underlined because those are the main deadlines, it's the time requirements, and we want feedback on those. DTSC has its goals. We want to get the fee rate to an accurate level, and that means conducting exemption review before the fee rate is set. But we recognize this is a new process, so we want to make sure generators can accurately provide this information and they have enough time to do it. So, okay, I've gone over the deadlines and notifications. Now let's try to synergize it on this next slide and hopefully make it clear. Next slide. Okay, so this flow chart is just one example of how the exemption review process can go. And let's work through it starting on the left. So the exemption review process begins in box 1 with DTSC sending a written notification to generators requesting information. The generator now has 30 days to provide information. In this particular example, though, the generator decides they need more than 30 days. So we move to box 2. And in this box, the generator sends a message to DTSC that they need additional time. DTSC will get back to the generator and let them know we confirmed, yes, you have an additional 15 days. So now it's in total 45 calendar days to provide the information. Eventually, if the process is going accordingly, that information provided in that 45 days, and we move to box 3. Here, DTSC has obtained the information and we are now reviewing it. And we will let the generator know we got the info and we're reviewing it. However, in this situation, the flowchart on the slide, the department decides that more information is needed. So we move now to box 4. And this is in this step, the generator is notified they have another 30 calendar days to provide additional information. Eventually, that information is provided, and we move to the final box 5, where DTSC reviews that information, the information provided in the first 45 days, and then the additional information in the 30 days, and makes its final evaluation. DTSC sends its evaluation both to the generator and CDTFA. At this point, the review process is finished. And this is just an example of the longest possible process, how it'll go down, because there's an additional information submittal period and a 15-day extension. So that's just an example, and hopefully that clarifies how it could work. So that's pretty much the framework for the exemption review process, the steps. But now we also need to discuss the information that's essential to this process. So what information that I keep mentioning that generators need to provide to the department so that we can evaluate the exemption. Let's talk about that. Next slide, please. Okay, if you recall from earlier, this is going to be the second set of regulations, and these regulations are about the information generators will be expected to maintain if they claim an exemption from the generation handling fee. So this is for generators that claim an exemption. These are record keeping requirements for them. This section 2 is what's going to be referred to. You'll refer to the section whenever there's a requirement for information that must be provided. The information requirements will be outlined in this section, and they're split into 2 parts. 1, it's baseline information required for all exemptions. And 2, information that is relevant for specific exemptions. When the process begins and DTSC asks for information, the expectation is that generators will provide both of these. So there are 10 exemptions and 1 deduction from the fee. And each of these exemptions or deductions will have their own information that must be provided in addition to baseline information, regardless of the exemption you claim. So for example, if a generator claims an exemption because they are a household hazardous waste facility and they're claiming the exemption for the waste that they collect, if they are selected for review by the department, that facility will need to provide baseline information, but also information that is particularly relevant and specific to that household hazardous waste collection exemption. Okay, with that introduction, we can go into the details of this and give some examples. Next slide, please. Okay, on this slide, we will start with the baseline information that all generators claiming exemption must maintain, and if they're chosen for review, provide to the department. This information is not a checklist, meaning this does not identify every possible record, log, or document that is necessary. But the regulations will provide examples of what is likely to be sufficient. However, generators know their waste best and should provide equivalent information at their discretion. So the baseline information, the concept DTSC proposes is 1, explanation of the information provided and the circumstances leading to the generation of the exempted waste. DTSC effectively here wants a narrative or a cover letter type document that explains the generation of the waste, why it is exempt, and how the information that is provided relates to that exemption. Generators must be particular with the information they provide, and DTSC expects the information to be purposeful and curated. 2, documentation pursuant to Title 22 of California Code of Regulations, Section 66262.40, record keeping. So this section is a regulatory section that already has record keeping requirements for generators. This section specifically requires test results, biannual reports, and exception reports, and manifests. So that information as well. 3, relevant shipping documentation, including but not limited to manifest numbers, bills of lading, logs, invoices, and movement documents associated with the waste. Relevant is underlined here, as it's up to the generator to decide which documents are most pertinent. And then 4, any other documentation the generator believes supports the claim of the exemption. This is the baseline information for all exemptions. If you claim any manner of exemption to the generation handling fee, this information will be expected to be maintained and provided upon request at minimum. Further, DTC proposes this information does not need to be maintained indefinitely, but for 3 years since the end of the calendar year in which the waste was generated. this 3-year timeline will also apply to the information required for specific exemptions. So those specific exemption information requirements, we can look at that in these next few slides. Next slide, please. So DTSC has identified 10 different exemptions and 1 deduction from the generation handling fee that will be specified in this section of the regulations. DTSC proposes the regulations provide examples of the information a generator must provide for the specific exemption being claimed. And to reiterate, this is in addition to that baseline information we just went over in the last slide. In the interest of time, though, we will only be going over 3 exemptions in the next few slides. These are the governmental response exemption, the exemption for waste separated during a load checking program, and household do-it-yourself for used oil. Next slide. Okay, quick callback. You may recall this slide from earlier in the exemption criteria presentation that Taylor did. So this is a list of all the 10 exemptions and 1 deduction. The handout for this presentation that I keep mentioning that's on the fees webpage has all these exemptions and concepts and their record keeper requirements. For these next few slides I mentioned, we're just going to be looking at 3 of them, and that's the governmental response, load checking program, and household do-it-yourself for used oil. But we have concepts of information for all of these exemptions and deductions. So please check out that handout if you wish to know more. So with that, we can start on the next slide with governmental response. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this is for the governmental response exemption. This exemption is specifically for when a governmental agency takes a removal, remedial, or corrective action to address a release of a hazardous substance caused by another person. If you claim this exemption, this information must be maintained and provided upon request. 1, supporting documentation demonstrating the governmental agency or its contractor is not the original generator. 2, evidence immediate action was necessary, such as call logs from emergency response centers or photos of the situation. 3, any other documentation that supports the claim of the exemption. And this 3 will be included for all the record keeping requirements because the generator might have additional information they feel is valuable. So this information was made to mesh with the criteria regulations that Taylor discussed earlier. DTSC has identified governmental response as being among the most inaccurately applied exemptions. So it is important that this review process verifies these exemption claims. Okay, so the first example, governmental response, we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, the next exemption example is the exemption for waste separated during a load checking program. The current concept is that DTSC will require the following information. 1, records such as a log or inventory documenting that the waste was generated as part of the load checking program. 2, any other documentation that supports the claim of the exemption. DTSC has kept this open-ended, and the concept is asking for anything that shows the facility keeps track of hazardous waste removed during load checking programs. DTSC basically just needs documents, logs, or receipts that are maintained on site, which keep track of hazardous waste separated from solid waste. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we're on to the last example for these slides. And the last example is for the collection of household do-it-yourselfer used oil. DTSC proposes the regulations require the following. 1, records of the amount of household do-it-yourselfer used oil that was collected during the calendar year as required by Health and Safety Code 25174.8.1A4B. 2, certification as a used oil collection center pursuant to Public Resources Code 48660. And 3, any other documentation that supports the claim of the exemption. Okay, so that's the last of the examples of record keeping for specific fee exemptions. And it'll be the last of me talking for a little while. So the next slide, we can go over some quick things before we open up to that feedback period. So as of course, we encourage you all to provide any feedback you feel valuable. We want to hear from everybody. But that handout that I've mentioned on the fees webpage, links in the chat, has some questions that we at DTSC particularly want feedback on, and it relates to this exemption review process. If you haven't had a chance to look at that handout, we have included one of those questions on this slide. So what we would like to know, what sort of information is currently maintained or could be reasonably obtained by generators? Information like we provided to the department for this review process. So the examples we went over the slide, particularly want to know what kind of information is there for governmental response, load checking programs, and household do-it-yourself reused oil. So we would appreciate feedback on this question on the slide or any of the questions in the handout if you've had a chance to look at that. But please offer any feedback or questions you have, whether in person or by the QR code on the slide. With that, I'll pass it back to Peter to field Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Spencer. So we have had a lot of comments and questions submitted through the QR code. So we are receiving those, and staff is working behind the scenes to get some responses together. Just wanted to provide a reminder that our focus today is to accept feedback specifically on the proposed emergency regulations. So we would appreciate if our audience can focus on their feedback on the regulation concepts that we're presenting today to help us with developing some solid regulations. We're now going to accept comments or questions on the exemption review process from our live audience. And for our virtual audience, once again, please use that QR code. We are receiving your feedback through there, and we will be responding to them shortly after our next presentation. Do we have anyone in the audience that would like to speak? There's no one in the audience at the moment that would like to speak. So what we'll do now is we'll take a 10-minute stretch break here, and we'll come back to discuss penalty concepts. So we'll be back in 10 minutes, which is at 4:10. Thank you. Okay, we are back. And next, this is our last presentation. We're going to hear from Ms. Catherine Grant, and she's going to talk about our penalty assessment framework for noncompliance with reporting requirements. Kate?
Where's the card for Meredith? Thank you, Peter. As noted earlier, I'm Catherine Grant, the Fiscal Policy Manager for DTSC. I'd like to discuss the penalty assessment framework DTSC is developing for noncompliance with hazardous waste reporting requirements, such as the EVQ presentation you saw earlier today. Next slide. SB 156 amended Health and Safety Code to authorize DTSC to assess penalties for noncompliance with hazardous waste reporting requirements for EVQ, TQR, and treated wood waste system. This is in addition to DTSC's existing penalty authority under Health and Safety Code 25187 and 25189.2. DTSC is currently in the process of developing a penalty assessment framework for hazardous waste reporting requirements. Thus far, the department has identified 4 potential reporting violations that would be assessed per EPID number. The penalties for each violation would increase over time up to a cap per EPID for each violation type. The penalty caps proposed for each violation are based on the impacts or magnitude of harm of the violation. It's important to note that each of the violations proposed directly impact the generation and handling fee. The generation and handling fee, as Peter discussed earlier, is annually set by the Board of Environmental Safety. The rates they adopt are based on the tonnage generated in the previous calendar year and the revenues needed to sustain DTSC's operations based on our budget and fund condition statement, with up to a 10% reserve. These rates are required to be adopted by October 1st of each year. As a result, Timely reporting to hazardous waste generation and handling data is imperative to effectively set rates and CDTFA's ability to accurately administer and collect the fees from fee payers. DTSC requires timely reporting to ensure the correct tonnage subject to the fee is provided to the Board of Environmental Safety in time for them to consider in the rate setting process. Failure to do so would result in the rate setting or the rate being set either too or high or too low. Most likely too high because DTSC would assume less waste is subject to the fee, resulting in compliant generators having to pay a higher per ton rate than necessary. Additionally, it's important to note that the timeline on rate setting is very narrow. In this last year, the board and DTSC began holding public workshops on fees in April and again in May. DTSC presented fee scenarios to the board in July, and then the board held another fee workshop in early August and voted at the end of August, all in an effort to make the October 1st rate setting deadline. With this in mind, violations currently under consideration include failure to report on time, failure to report at all, inaccurate reporting, then fraud or knowingly reporting false or inaccurate information to the department. DTSC is evaluating the inclusion of violation adjustments for circumstances beyond the reporter's control, or when a reporter demonstrates a good faith effort to comply with the reporting requirements. Next slide. Now, before we begin discussing the penalty assessment framework and each of the violation types further, I want to discuss where the penalty funds would go. First and foremost, I want to emphasize that the penalty monies would not be deposited into the hazardous waste control account, which funds the hazardous waste management program and is primarily supported by the generation and handling fee. This program would not benefit or be funded from these penalties. The proposed penalties are solely intended to compel compliance with the hazardous waste generation and handling reporting requirements. In fact, pursuant to Health and Safety Code 25173.6, penalties assessed under Chapter 6.5 are deposited into the Toxic Substances Control account. This fund supports DTSC's Site Mitigation and Restoration Program, which oversees the cleanup of contaminated properties throughout the state, our Safer Consumer Products, which compels manufacturers to produce more chemically safe products for people in the environment, and also funds the Site Remediation account for the cleanup of Superfund and orphan sites. Next slide. Now let's discuss the penalty violation structure. DTSC is evaluating two potential penalty frameworks and would like feedback and stakeholder perspectives on these two proposed models. The first option would be assessing a flat rate penalty based on the tonnage generated at each EPA ID site within a tier structure. Please note that the tiers on this slide are consolidated for illustration purposes. DTSC is proposing to have 6 tiers, wherein the 5 to 500 ton displayed on the screen would be further delineated, which you can see in our draft language provided for this workshop. Alternatively, DTSC is considering assessing a penalty with a per violation base rate plus a per ton rate. The benefits to the tiered rate would be the predictability of a set violation rate, whereas the violation base rate plus a per ton rate provides more flexibility and potentially lower penalties to smaller hazardous waste generators, which make up the bulk of the hazardous waste generators and handlers in the state. Next slide. Penalties for failure to report on time would be assessed when a reporter fails to report by the reporting deadline for each reporting system. The penalty assessed would be based on the length of delinquency and would be escalated up to $5,000 per EPID. An example of a failure to report on time violation would be if the generator fails to report within that April 15th or March 15th deadline for EVQ. This would result in DTSC assessing escalating penalties for this violation, again, based on the delinquency period. Similarly, in the Transporter Quarterly Report, often called TQR, another reporting system used for the administration of the generation and handling fee, transporters are required to report in TQR within 30 days at the end of the quarter. Failure to report within those 30 days would result in a failure to report on time penalty. Next slide. Now, should a generator fail to report within the reporting period, DTSC would assess a failure to report penalty for each ID number that does not comply with the reporting deadlines. The penalty rate would escalate for each reporting period the ID number did not report. The escalated rate would be capped at $25,000 per EPID. Now let's take a look at the next slide. To demonstrate how both the failure to report on time and the failure to report at all violations would apply, DTSC is proposing two penalty frameworks as referenced earlier. This would mean for the tiered rate, an escalating rate would be applied based on the tonnage generated and the duration of delinquency, up to and until the reporting period ends, after which a failed to report violation would be applied instead of the failed to report on time violation. The timely reporting violations are not additive. Rather, the highest penalty would prevail, again, per EPID. I want to reiterate that this slide includes consolidated tiers for illustration purposes, but DTSC is proposing additional tiers that could be referenced in the draft language provided. The alternative penalty framework, the base rate plus tonnage structure, would function and be applied the same as the tiered rate, but the fee calculation would not be fixed. Rather, a violation base rate would be applied plus a per ton rate on the hazardous waste generated in the reporting period. Late reporting penalties would increase up to the cap based on the length of the reporting delinquency and would result in a failure to report violation if an EPID is not reported on for the reporting period up to a $25,000 per EPID cap. As noted earlier, timely and accurate reporting is essential to both setting the rates for the generation and handling fee and administering and collecting the fee. Failure to report essentially results in the tonnage generated potentially not being considered in the rate setting. This would mean compliant generators would bear an inaccurate or disproportionate portion of DTSC's cost, undermining the fairness and equitability to all generators. Equity was one of the core principles of fee reform and is foundational to the department. The fee caps reflected for the failure to report and failure to report on time violations reflect this. Untimely reporting still results in DTSC receiving the data for consideration and rate setting, which is why it has the $5,000 cap, whereas failure to report doesn't. Next slide. DTSC is also evaluating and considering assessing penalties for inaccurate reporting to the department. Inaccurate reporting results when a handler, by EPID, inaccurately reports on the waste generated or handled at a site. Handlers are responsible for tracking, managing, and reporting on the waste either generated or handled. Maintaining records of these activities is essential to comply with reporting requirements and are required to be maintained. Failure to accurately report on generation and handling activities may result in inaccurate reporting penalties. I would note DTSC is not seeking to assess penalties on every discrepancy and good faith efforts to comply. But if a generator and handler inaccurately or untimely reports information in EVQ, TQR, or our treated wood waste system, again, the three systems used for generation and handling fees, penalties could apply. An example of this could be if a handler incorrectly reports to DTSC. You may be assessed fines for reporting to the department inaccurately. I would note, in most cases, if you simply cannot support your claim, DTSC will simply invalidate the exemption and not attach a penalty. But if the generator cannot demonstrate a good faith effort or withholds material facts during DTSC's calculation process, an inaccurate reporting violation could apply. Good faith effort could be demonstrated by correcting your report, if possible, or correcting manifests pursuant to the statutory or regulatory requirements. For the next few slides, let's use the same example of the DIY used oil generator and how the same set of circumstances may result in different violations. So a generator of DIY used oil claims an exemption, but they are neither certified or do not maintain any records of the DIY that they have collected from the public. The generator hasn't accurately reported to the department the amount of DIY oil it collected. In this example, the exemption could be invalidated with no financial penalty, or an inaccurate reporting violation could apply, particularly if the amount of the DIY used oil generated is repeatedly reported without substantiation or demonstration of a good faith effort to accurately comply with the reporting requirements. Next slide. This slide illustrates the two penalty frameworks under consideration. As with other violations, the rates escalate based on the number of violations over time per EPID and are capped at $15,000 per EPID per violation. Again, with the tiered structure providing a fixed penalty and the base rate plus ton a variable one. Next slide. Fraud and inaccurate reporting are going to look very similar, and I'd like to discuss that a bit more today. But as a result of this similarity, the same set of circumstances may result in inaccurate reporting or rise to a level of fraud or knowingly reporting false information to the department, with the willful and knowingly component impacting which violations would be assessed. Fraud is considered the most egregious violation, and penalties for this would be capped at $70,000 per EPID. The tiered rate structure would result in an escalating penalty rate up to the cap, but the flat rate would be limited to $70,000 per violation per EPID. Now, using the same example from the inaccurate reporting slide, where a DIY oil generator who is not certified and cannot document or maintain records of the DIY oil collected is still inaccurately reported to the department and files a claim. In this case, if the department has evidence that the generator knowingly or willfully reported false or inaccurate information to the department, DTSC could assess a penalty fraud or fraud penalty. Next slide. This slide illustrates the two penalty frameworks under consideration. As with other violations, the rates escalated in the tiered structure are based on the number of violations over time per EPID. Alternatively, the flat rate plus per tonnage would not be adjusted and would be a singular flat rate of $70,000 per violation. Next slide. So this concludes DTSC's portion of presenting the penalty framework that is currently under consideration. But we'd like to hear from you and get your perspective and feedback. Particularly, we'd like to solicit feedback on the overall penalty framework. As a stakeholder, is there a preference on the penalty structure and the caps for each violation? Are there other possible violations that have not been presented today? In addition, could you please provide feedback on the failure to report and failure to report timelines presented? Are there circumstances in which violations should be waived or adjusted that may affect your ability to comply with reporting requirements? Additionally, we'd like to hear any other comments or feedback related to the penalty structure presented. Peter?
Thank you, Kate. So we'll now accept comments or questions on the penalty matrix framework from our live audience. Do we have anyone in the audience that would like to speak on this matter? Okay, seeing none. For our virtual audience, once again, please use the QR code on this slide to submit your comments or questions. And we'll give you a minute or two to submit those comments and questions in that QR code, and then we'll move along. Can we go to our next slide, please? Thank you. So that concludes our presentations, and I'll leave this slide up as a reminder that you can provide feedback until November 1st using the QR code, and that all materials prepared for this workshop can be accessed at the link to the fees regulation webpage shown on this slide. We'll now transition over to the comments and questions that were submitted by our virtual participants. Please note that while we may not be able to get to all comments and questions before the end of this meeting, all submittals will be carefully reviewed, evaluated, and given consideration when developing our regulations. I'll now turn it over to Jessica Twining, an environmental program manager within our hazardous waste management program, and she'll lead the responses to the comments and questions that our virtual audience has submitted throughout our presentations. Please note that we'll be transitioning to questions from our Board of Environmental Safety at approximately 5:15 p.m. And so I'll turn it over to Jessica now. Jessica?
Thank you, Peter. So I'm going to be reading the written feedback we've received from both the Zoom Q&A and in the form that was accessed using the QR code that's displayed currently in this presentation. I do want to remind you all that since we have not started the official rulemaking process yet, this feedback is very critical for us to finalize the regulation text. And as Peter mentioned, you can actually access the current draft regulatory text that the team has been working on our website. But I also want to assure you all the text is going to change based on the feedback we received today and then over the next couple of weeks. So similar to the sentiments Peter shared, I do want to thank you all in advance for the time you've taken to listen to the presentation and to provide feedback that we need to finalize this regulation text before we can start the official rulemaking process. Like Peter mentioned, it's unlikely we'll be able to get through all of the feedback we've received, but please be assured we are going to be going through every piece of feedback we've gotten so far. I also want to take a minute to note that there were several comments and questions related to activities that are under CDTFA's authority. Since that's outside of the purview of our focus in this workshop, I'm going to be skipping those comments as I read these out loud. But we do recommend that you contact CDTFA directly or visit their website for more information about your account or how to file a return. Okay, so with that, so the first question, or one of the questions we received was, why are the regulations changing? So we hope that this workshop and this presentation has answered that question. I know we've been fielding some of these questions in the chat. All of the materials are actually on our website currently. So we hope that this workshop's been helpful in learning about why we're undertaking these efforts. The next is, what is the current fee for the 2024-2025 fiscal year? So the Board of Environmental Safety recently changed the generation and handling fee rate to $60.05 for waste generated in calendar year 2023. This change just went into effect and on October 1st of this year, so just a couple weeks ago. All right, the next question is treated wood waste required to be reported and fees assessed if we are directly landfilling all treated wood waste received? Yes, treated wood waste is still going to be subject to the generation and handling fee. So you'll be required to report that waste stream in the electronic verification questionnaire, or EVQ, that Josephine was discussing earlier in the presentation. And then you'll also need to document that in the return that you file with CDTFA. All right, the next question is, will universal waste reporting be required in the future like it was this year? At this point, we do not anticipate universal waste to be reported into EVQ next year. However, as I mentioned, this is something we're considering as we finalize the regulation text based on the feedback we received today. All right, the next question was, for electric utilities, is treated wood waste exempted for the generator calculation? So treated wood waste is not an exempt waste, meaning it's not a waste that's exempt from the generation and handling fee. So it will be still subject to fees.
Jessica, let me add to that. So for public utility poles, they are exempt from hazardous waste requirements under certain conditions. So those would not be subject to the fee if they meet those conditions.
All right, and I do want to note we received several comments related to the March 15th due date, especially in relation to other due dates for reporting. We do appreciate that feedback. We are taking it into consideration, and we are going to evaluate if an alternative timeline would be achievable. And so we do appreciate that feedback. It is very helpful. All right, the next question is, will EVQ be required for all IDs, both temporary and permanent? Yes, as Josephine mentioned, the EVQ is going to be required for all generators, including temporary and permanent ID holders. The exceptions are if you are a household or a tribal land. I'm sorry, we're getting feedback in the room. So just a second. Test. Okay, I think we're good. I think it's been fixed. All right, thank you. Okay, sorry for that brief pause. Okay, so can you provide more details on the unmanifested waste that needs to be reported? So currently, we're evaluating having treated wood waste and any waste that has been granted a variance pursuant to Health and Safety Code Section 25143, and would not be required to be manifested pursuant to that variance. Those would be the two waste streams that would still have to be reported. All right. The next question is, what if I am a transfer facility and show as the generator on the manifest, but I did not actually generate the waste? Do I have to report that waste in EVQ? And do I have to pay the fee for that waste? So EVQ is going to allow you to indicate what waste you're claiming for an exemption from the generation and handling fee, that is. And if you did not generate the waste, you are not responsible for paying the fee for it. All right, the next question is, will you be importing data for consolidated manifests? And will next year's report require individual consolidated manifests per ID number as originally requested before it was modified? Or will it remain the total for the ID number for the year? See if Josephine can take this one.
Hi. For transporters, we are planning to upload TQR data that we have into EVQ so that the transporters can verify this data instead of having to report it. And we are proposing in regulations for transporters to report or verify the individual consolidated manifests per ID again, which we are looking to upload if it already exists in TQR.
All right. So the next comment is, it would be helpful if EVQ can update immediately after changes in HWTS, it's the hazardous waste tracking system. Currently, changes to manifest data like pounds or gallons or tons is reflected very quickly in HWTS and not in EVQ. So thank you for the feedback. That's helpful and something we'll take into consideration. All right, the next question is, do we need to be part of this program if we do not generate more than 5 tons of waste each year? So by program, I'm assuming you mean the requirement to report into EVQ. So all handlers, whether they generate 5 or more tons of waste, are not responsible. Sorry. I'm going to refer this to Josephine.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so it says, do we need to be part of the program if we do not generate more than 5 tons of waste each year? So by program, I'm assuming that means reporting into EVQ.
Yeah, so if the handler met the reporting requirements, even if they didn't generate more than 5 tons of waste each year, then they would have to report in EVQ. So that is the reporting requirements, as a refresher, are if the site had an active ID number in California at any time in the previous calendar year, and or if they generated, transported, treated, stored, or disposed of hazardous waste in the prior calendar year. So if they met those requirements, then they must file, unless they are either on federally recognized tribal land, or if they are a occupant of a household that only generates household hazardous waste.
All right, thank you, Josephine. Okay, the next question is, if I generate 7 tons per year, do I pay on 7 tons or 2 tons? So you actually pay for the full 7 tons of waste. The threshold for requiring a payment is if you've generated 5 tons. So, for example, if you generate 5 tons in the prior calendar year, you would pay on all 5 tons. So you would pay that, for example, if it's 2023 hazardous waste, you'd pay that $60.05 per 5 tons that you generated. All right, so the next comment, the pass-through deduction in the EPA hazardous waste code of H141 needs more clarification. If I generate waste on-site, then treat it on-site at my TSDF, there should be no generation and handling fee. If I received waste from off-site, then the originating site pays the generation and handling fee. I'm not sure if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, so I guess to answer the first part of the question, waste is generated on-site and treated on-site is covered under its own exemption. That's the on-site treatment exemption. You can find that exemption in Health and Safety Code 25174.8.1. And I'm blanking on the subsection there. The second part of the question, can you repeat the second part, Jessica?
Yeah, so it says, if I generate on-site and treat the waste on-site, the TSDF, there should be no generation and handling fee. And then if I received it from off-site, then the originating site pays the generation and handling fee.
Yeah, so the originating generator would pay the generation and handling fee. And yeah, there are situations, I guess, that would result in a new generation activity where you would have to pay the fee as well. But the original generator would pay a fee.
Thanks, Taylor. I also want to address a frequent comment and question that's come in related to this workshop. So the PowerPoint is already posted on our website. You can actually access it on the link that's being displayed currently or on the current slide. This is also going to be recorded, so you can view this at a later date. It'll be posted on our website for future viewing and access. All right, so the next question is, what is the cited regulation explaining that universal waste is exempt from the generation and handling fee? So that exemption is in statute. It's in Health and Safety Code, section 25174.8.1A7. But okay, so the next question is, do generators need to request to be considered for an exemption before DTSC requests the information? Spencer, would you?
Yeah, so the question, we've seen this a few times, is do generators have to request an exemption? So when we're talking about the exemption review process, the way it works is generators are not going to go to the department and request an exemption. Generators will claim an exemption with CTFA, or when they report with EVQ, they'll state exemptions. And then the department can choose after a certain amount of time after that to follow up with that generator that claimed an exemption. So it's not necessarily requesting from the department. It's that the department may choose to follow up with the generator that claims an exemption and ask that they provide information to verify that exemption.
Thank you, Spencer. All right, the next question is, can we get a simple form to send homeowners that explains this in simplified terms and include building owners? That's a great suggestion, and it is something we will look into. We do want to make it as transparent and clear about what the requirements are, and also make it as easy as possible for generators to comply. So we appreciate the comment, and that is something we'll look into. All right. The next comment is related to the exemption review process. So 30 days may not be enough time to deliver the exemption documents to DTSC. Can we have 60 days? This is something we can look into, and we, again, appreciate this type of feedback. So we'll look into how that, if that would be possible. So our company did not receive a notification when it was time to complete our questionnaire. I assume that means EVQ. If we do not receive a notification, there is no way to know, when the portal is open for submissions. Is there another method of communication other than mail, USPS mail, that could be used as a backup for notifications to be sure the company receives the notice? I had to watch the portal website to find out when the portal was open, and the mail system is unreliable.
Sure. So for EVQ, we have been sending notifications out through email if there are email addresses provided to us for the ID number that are already linked to your ID number. We only send out notifications through mail if there is no email address attached to the ID number. If you are concerned about whether or not we have your ID number associated with your email address on file, feel free to email the EVQ team to make sure you get that email notification. And that email address is evq@dtsc.ca.gov.
All right, thank you, Josephine. Okay. So this next question is also related to the exemption review process. So does the exemption review by DTSC mean that CDTFA will not perform an audit? Historically, CDTFA would audit us when the amounts we claimed did not align with HWTS data. We've provided CDTFA with weighmaster certificates to show conversion factor issues, and that resolved the appearance of underreporting. Go ahead.
Hi. So for this question, to clarify with the exemption review process, CDTFA does conduct its own audits, and they will continue to do so. And this review process is its own separate thing. It's not overlapping or takes causes the other to not happen. The review process is for DTSC on its own to evaluate exemptions being claimed so that we can set a equitable fee rate and try to help generators better understand how to apply exemptions accurately.
All right. Thank you, Spencer. Okay. The next question is, can the exemptions be requested prior to the event? Spencer, would you?
Yeah, so we've received some of these questions. Can exemptions be requested prior to the event? So the way it works is that you're not going to the department to request an exemption in advance. What you do is say, such as through EVQ, you report that you're claiming an exemption on waste, or if you filed with CDTFA, there's a spot to claim an exemption, and that's where that information goes. So you're not requesting with the department an exemption, but from those avenues for reporting, DTC might choose to follow up on an exemption claim, and then the review process happens. Yeah.
And just to add to that a bit, the EVQ is based on the waste, and also the generation and handling fee is based on the waste generated in the prior calendar year, meaning the waste would already have to be generated in order to report it. The exemption review process is intended to ensure that DTSC has the correct and accurate data to provide the board for their rate setting purposes, and also to provide CDTFA for the return filing process. And so no exemptions could be claimed in advance. The waste would have to be generated already in either of these situations.
Spencer and Kate. All right, we have another question related to the exemption review process. So when will DTSC request information for the review process, or that initiates the review process? Can there be a section on the EVQ to submit required information for exemptions and not have to wait for DTSC to reach out? Lots of solid waste facilities have different load check programs and household hazardous waste programs, and the record keeping is not likely similar. So could the department provide an example of a log that includes all required information that they would need to approve an exemption? This can streamline the review process and relieve handlers and generators from creating an insufficient log. Spencer?
Cool. So it seems like there's a few different questions here. We'll work down them. So to start, talk about when does DTSC request information from the review process? Well, the review process will be largely informed from reporting in EVQ and potentially filing with CDTFA. So it'll likely happen after the calendar year that the waste is generated and after filing with reporting with EVQ. So if you claim an exemption in that report, some of that information will be looked at, and then DTSC might follow up based on any other reporting of the exemption. So then when that happens, the generator will receive like a notice by mail or email, and like with the other feedback, we want to know the best way to notify generators, and then that information will have to be provided. Then there's mention of EVQ to submit that information ahead of time if you're claiming exemption. Well, we can consider that, but one of the considerations was that EVQ is a lot of information reporting, and we don't want to overburden generators. So we're considering at the moment to reaching out to generators. So not every generator has to provide all that information, and it could be more efficient to reach out to specific generators rather than require them all to mail it and provide it in ahead of time before we reach out to them. And then also mention of the low check programs, household hazardous waste, record keeping. So yeah, that's some feedback we really want feedback on, because we know what, say, the criteria for the exemption is, but we're not 100% certain on the information that is maintained on site, such as by these household hazardous waste facilities. So we would really love if people could contribute examples of what they do have or what they think they could obtain to provide to us to prove that exemption. We were thinking logs, such as like a load checking program, to indicate that there is at least tracking that the waste is being separated accordingly from the load check program. And that could be sufficient to verify the exemption. Yeah, but we want in the regs to expand on what we currently have and give really good examples so generators know what they have to provide or have an idea of what they can provide. So please contribute any feedback you might have on that, but we would love to know more.
All right, thank you, Spencer. Okay, so the next comment is related to the straw language. So the straw regulation language assumes that all waste is manifested in tons. That is not the case, and the use of different volume measurements, such as gallons and cubic yards, is where conversion factors become an issue. So this is where your rate tickets that you receive are going to be really critical, or when the load is received by the TSDF is so critical. And it's important to make sure that the manifest data is as accurate as possible to avoid those discrepancies that can sometimes result from conversion factors. All right. The next comment is related to the Q&A in the Zoom. So we're using this workshop right now primarily to get feedback on the draft regulation text that we have posted on our website and the general concepts that the panelists have presented today. If you have specific questions about a situation that your business is dealing with, I would recommend that you contact the department directly. So if you have questions related to EVQ, I know the cycle is open right now, you can direct those to evq@dtsc.ca.gov. If you have questions related to fees, you can direct those to fees@dtsc.ca.gov. Otherwise, we are capturing all of the questions that were submitted in the Q&A through Zoom in our own log. So it says answered live, but it's mainly so we could capture it in our log. All right. So the next comment is related to the electronic verification questionnaire. The proposed March due date will be extremely difficult or impossible on transporters. We have tens of thousands of customers that all request data to complete their EVQs and generation and handling reports. You'd have a better chance if you eliminated universal waste tonnage from both EVQ and the G&H reporting. So we appreciate that feedback, and that, again, is the type of feedback that's very helpful as we develop these regulations. All right, the next question is related to the exemption review process. Why are we having to perform duplicate reporting moving forward with CDTFA and DTSC? Go ahead.
Right. So kind of related to the discussion earlier is that CDTFA does its own audit process, and we share information with CDTFA when they are doing their audit process. But DTSC, because we have an obligation to help set the fee rate, provide an idea of the amount of hazardous waste being generated each year, DTSC is required by the statute to develop a process to verify that exemptions being claimed are accurate. And this is something that DTSC needs to do on its own because of the resources that are available to us and our familiarity with the hazardous waste. So some of this reporting for the exemption review process will only happen for some generators that are selected, but it'll provide us information for the department's own purposes that are different from CDTFA.
And if I could expand on that a bit, Spencer, in particular, prior to SB 156 and the enhancement of EVQ this year, DTSC really only had hazardous waste tracking data to use and provide to CDTFA for their administration of the fee, as well as to the board for their rate setting. And so this data in EVQ is going to be paramount to that rate setting process, but will also be provided to CDTFA for their audits. So historically, CDTFA has really only relied on the TQR and HWTS data to perform their audits. Their audits are limited to the return that was filed with them. It is not beyond that for their audit review. You have to have had filed the return. Whereas our exemption review process is going to be on any exemptions that are claimed in EVQ and will be provided to CDTFA. The determinations will be provided to CDTFA, but would be supplemental to CDTFA's activities. I also want to note a big distinction in timelines. The exemption review process would take place after the EVQ system opens. So after that March 15th due date, a DTSC can begin evaluating the exemptions claimed in EVQ. CDTFA does not even begin their audit process until about 15 months afterwards. They will begin their audit selection process the following May. So for instance, this year for the return due in February of 2025, CDTFA will begin doing their audit selection process in May and June of that year. So it is substantially later than DTSC's EVQ evaluation. So there's a big distinction in terms of timeline and the uses of these exemptions. CDTFA is trying to confirm that you appropriately filed a fee. DTSC is trying to affirm that you are appropriately reporting your waste.
All right, thank you, Spencer and Kate. Okay, the next question is related to the penalties. So why would a generator of less than 5 tons ever be subject to penalties?
Thank you. So a generator of less than 5 tons would be subject to penalties based on the failure to comply with reporting requirements. EVQ data is required on all handlers, not simply or limited to those generators who are responsible or liable for the generation and handling fee. So if you are a generator, regardless of whether you generate 5 or more tons and are subject to the generation and handling fee, you still are required to report the hazardous waste information that was generated under your site ID to the department and report that accurately. Failure to do so would be inaccurate reporting if you are reporting inaccurately, regardless of your fee status.
All right, so the next question is, can there be a webinar to cover just the exemptions that currently exist? This would be very useful. We thank you for that suggestion and feedback. That's definitely something we can take into consideration. All right, the next question is related to penalties. Does inaccurate reporting apply to a generator applying way tickets in place of using the information on a manifest?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. No, inaccurate reporting would be if you were not in good faith reporting inaccurate information to the department. It would not be if you were using your weight tickets, which we would view as the most accurate, over your manifest, which typically are based on conversion factors. So that would not be a basis for inaccurate reporting, provided you were able to substantiate the tonnage with those weight tickets. That would be perfectly fine and reasonable. It would really only be if you were inaccurately reporting to the department. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Okay, so the next question is, I believe this is related to the reporting for the electronic verification questionnaire. So the question is, does this include permanent household hazardous waste collection facilities? I'm going to ask Josephine to take that.
Household hazardous waste facilities would not be exempt from reporting an EVQ if they met the reporting requirements. And this reporting information does give the department better data quality.
Okay, thank you, Josephine. Okay, the next question is related to the exemption review process. So if we generate the ID on behalf of the homeowner or business, are we responsible for submitting the exemption and paying those fees? Or that to Spencer?
I'm sorry, I
can take
I
it.
tuned out because I heard it was a review process.
Let me repeat the question, at least for the panelists. Okay, if we generate the ID on behalf of the homeowner or business, are we responsible for submitting the exemption and paying those fees?
Sure, I can take that. So the generator is responsible for paying fees and filing any required reports like EBQ, unless they are a homeowner and exempt. If you are a consolidated transporter, you're responsible for adhering to the requirements in Health and Safety Code 25160.2. Thanks.
Thank you, Spencer. Just give me a second. Okay, so this is a comment related to the electronic verification questionnaire. There has to be notification multiple times from DTSC as the deadlines approach. As a business, we have many things bidding our attention. Josephine, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. So one of our goals is to have a fixed due date for EVQ as opposed to a flexible due date, as in previous years, to keep things consistent for filers. We do already send multiple notifications every cycle, but if you have any feedback about how and how often handlers would like to be reminded, we would appreciate that feedback.
I'm also going to add on to that in relation to the exemption review process, because there's discussion in there that DTSC will be sending notifications. So again, the question kind of relates to that too. The goal is to send out notifications. So we had a slide where we showed where all the notifications will be sent, and you can see that in the strong language and the handout. But if there needs to be more notifications or they need to be sent out in a certain way, please contribute that feedback. We want to know what works best for generators so we can make this as easy as possible for people to comply with. Thanks.
Okay, well, I think that, Jessica, are we ready to transition?
I have one more comment I want to read.
Okay.
I have a lot of comments, but a lot of them are kind of repeated, so we're trying to group them together. But I do have one more I wanted to read. So this is related to penalties. If an employee is new to a position and discovers some discrepancy by their predecessor and contacts the agency in good faith to correct or resubmit information, would the penalty still apply, provided there isn't any other obvious information suggesting negligent actions by the former employee? Kate, you want to take this?
Thank you, Jessica. That's a great question. And that's something DTSC is currently taking into consideration. Are there any situations in which we should consider adjustment factors? Situations, as noted before, where you identified an error, or perhaps a homeowner, a business owner is deceased and you're taking over, not realizing that that report was required. DTSC is evaluating circumstances in which adjustment factors could be considered, and it is noted 2 of those adjustment factors in the straw language provided today.
Thank you, Kate. And before I hand it back over to you, Peter, I do want to also remind people again, if you have questions that you want an immediate response from the department on, these, especially related to the electronic verification questionnaire, contact us at evq@dtsc.ca.gov. And then questions related to fees, please contact fees@dtsc.ca.gov.
Thank you, Jessica. So I want to thank the board for being very patient and open it up to any questions from the board.
Well, thank you. And thank you all the entire team there remotely. Thank you very much. Wow, that's deep. We spent a lot of time with Katie and her team, and this just expands the sheer volume that you all are dealing with. So I want to open it up for any board questions or comments. Alexis?
Yes, I would like to thank the team here and the team on the screen. Thank you. I know there's a lot of hard work involved in this draft regulation text, and it follows on our fee setting process, which is part of our annual cycle of work. The questions that we heard, in addition to all of those you were reviewing online, really focus more on implementation than on regulatory language per se. So while I know the goal of this workshop was the regulatory language, I think that the questions can help us all understand the areas of difficulty that the regulated public has, and our shared goal with the regulated public in getting it right and making it easy to comply. And I'm wondering, in that vein, if you're thinking that it might be possible to have a measure of small business assistance on the reporting part, so that someone could call in with a question during normal business hours. I know the emphasis has been on email, and to that end, I wondered, is there an ability for people there were over 300 people, were there not, Madam Chair, on Zoom wanting to see this workshop. And I'm wondering, is it possible for them to see all the questions and your responses somewhere? Is it possible for someone who may not be a native English speaker to call in and ask a question of you at some point? What is the opportunity for people with specific business questions who want to comply to be able to talk with you? Is it primarily an email exchange? And if so, can they see what other people are asking that might help them?
Thank you. And I'll turn that over to Jessica. But yes, I mean, I think we all kind of get the same feeling. There's questions that feedback we were seeking from the regulations, but there's this other universe of questions that are out there as well that beg the question about, okay, how can we better serve the public with respect to being available to answer those questions? Now, granted, some of them were questions for CDTFA, but some of them were for us too. So that's what we have to kind of see how we can integrate that and make sure that people can get to the right spot to get their question answered. But with respect to some of the specifics, I can turn that over to Jessica right now.
And can I just add a corollary based on CDTFA? Is it possible for someone to call CDTFA and have a phone engagement with them around their particular account?
Yes,
I don't know.
and I know, I believe we have frequent meetings with CDTFA, so we are in communication with them. But I'll let Jessica and Kate answer some of those specifics.
Thanks.
Mhm.
No, thank you. That is very helpful. And we noticed a similar trend. So with respect to the electronic verification questionnaire or EVQ, I know I've been referencing the email mailbox that people can email their questions into. I think somebody is not muted, and we can hear a lot of shuffling and feedback. Okay, thank you. Excuse me. Okay, so, but there is actually we have a telephone information center that is open every day from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. I will give you their phone number right now.
I have it available if you'd like.
Go ahead, Josephine.
So our telephone number for EVQ assistance for reporting is 1-877-454-4012. And again, 1-877-454-4012. And that's for specific questions on how to actually complete EVQ. And as Jessica said, again, that is available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.
In regards to CDTFA, I do want to note that CDTFA has a number of online resources, including various walkthrough videos for registration, filing a return, and making a prepayment. You could also work with them directly by contacting them via email. Their email is actually through their website, which is cdtfa.ca.gov/email/. And then you could call them directly at 1-800-400-7115.
I know you also asked about, is there a way for us to capture all the comments and questions we've received and respond to them? I do want to back up and add that one of our goals is to try to have these regulations in effect by the beginning of next year. So our efforts right now are, really want to focus on addressing the feedback we've received related to the text to make it more robust, implementable, clear to those that are impacted by these regulations, in addition to developing those outreach materials and resources. So those that are impacted have something to refer to and they know what to expect come next year. So I would like to say we could, but I don't want to make that commitment given the different priorities we have over the next few months. We just have a very short window to get these regulations completed. But we do appreciate the feedback and the suggestion.
Thank you for that. Any other board questions? I'll jump in with one. Thank you. I think Spencer, I think it was your set, starting with slide number 41, where it talks about record keeping requirements. So the requirement to keep all relevant records. And then it goes on to be a little bit, I'm going to say unclear, but how will someone know what records to keep? Absolutely, and be ready if selected. And then my second part of my question is, what's the basis for selecting, and what percentage will you select for review or audit? We went through this with CDTFA on fee collection, and it was a very small percentage that were audited. So I raised that question, but also for someone to know absolutely what records they're supposed to keep in the event that they are selected on the exemptions, then it wouldn't seem to me that they would require 30 days to send you that if they're keeping their records. So just trying to drill down on that a little bit, because I know we've heard from fee payers with some confusion around what do they have to provide, when, and what are they keeping. So I found slide 41, unless there's more documents that flow from that, to be very general.
So I'll let Spencer answer, but just to preface that, yes, we do know that that it needs a little bit more specificity. I think that we have an idea of what records we might want to see, and we were hoping to get feedback from our workshop here today from participants that would give us some more options to identify specific documents that they would be able to provide to us, so that we could specify those in the regulation, so that we can be more specific in terms of these are the documents that we need, and these are the ones we're willing to accept to document the exemption. So, but Spencer can answer in more detail.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. Pretty much all what Peter said is true, but to elaborate more on that. So your first question, how will generators know what to provide? So from those slides that you're mentioning, like 41 onward, there's the entire regulation section will go into detail on two parts. It'll be, to reiterate, sorry, I think we need to mute just there's a little feedback. Cool, thank you. So we expect that because there's 10 exemptions and one deduction, all of them are kind of different. And we think that there's going to be different ways to that information that relates to that exemption. So if you're a household hazardous waste facility and you're exempting waste you collected from households, the information you provide for that will probably be different from, say, if you're doing pass-through waste. So you're dealing with your waste is coming through your site, your TSDF. And we expect that information will be different, and we want to put in the regs examples of what the department currently thinks would be valuable, and we want to be as specific as possible. We want generators to know, okay, this is what I can provide. But we have in the regulations that part where it says any other documentation that proves, like, supports the claim of the exemption. So we want feedback so we can build out those regs and give more examples so they have a better idea of what they can provide. But it'll ultimately kind of be up to the generator. And then we've had a list of information that we think that all generators, no matter what exemption you claim, you'll probably need to provide. So it's stuff like manifests. I mean, that's probably going to be very valuable, and you probably have access to that. And then say you got shipping documentation like logs or invoices. So that's kind of like broad, we expect you to provide. And we want the regs to be very much more specific on the exemption you claim. So we hope we get feedback that'll help us flesh that out. And in the future, we might improve on it and make it more specific so generators know what they have to do. But that's just what we presented. It's just how it is right now. And you can check out the handout and straw language to see more for some of the other exemptions. I'm sorry, it was a little second question that you mentioned was, so what's the criteria for being selected for review? So that's still being figured out because we want to make sure that we're looking at all different kinds of exemptions. And the goal is to figure out, how much is being exempted and accurately do generators understand it? Because part of this is education. A lot of generators we're clarifying exemptions because there's confusion. So we would want to spread the review process out so enough generators begin to learn what the correct exemption application is. But I can't say that there's one clear criteria of who we're going to go after. It's just that it could change depending on the department's information at the time. And based on what we think would be most valuable to review. Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's the word required. So if you're required, it's always good to know what you're required to do. And then is there something that if someone isn't keeping the required documents? I mean, that came up during the fees process. So thank you for acknowledging that needs more clarity because you can't penalize someone for not keeping records that you haven't told them what to keep, right?
Yeah, I'll add on too, because you're correct. We don't know all the kinds of information generators have that prove the exemption. We know what the criteria of the exemption is, but it could vary from generator to generator. So we want to make it as easy as possible. And that's part of why we're putting in those deadlines. If we're very clear what the generator needs to provide, then they should be able to provide it immediately. But we know that there's some considerations, some difficulties. That's why we have an extension period if they need it, so they can have additional time to comply. And this is a new process. But we want feedback to let generators know if they think it's feasible or not, what we can do to make it more specific. But the more feedback we get, the better we can make this process go versus doing the process. And there's a little bit of growing pains, but we hope to make it very streamlined and easy for generators to comply.
And just to follow on, do you have a target percentage that you'll want to review? Some percentage of exemptions that you'll select for review, or will it be the ones that pop for you that just don't seem to be accurate or adequate?
Yeah, so that's still under consideration by the department, and we're not sure if we're ready to disclose that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other board questions?
Okay, well, on behalf of DTSC, we'd like to thank you, Chair Rizzo, and the board and all the board staff for helping us and giving us the time to present this workshop during your board meeting. We really appreciate it.
Well, we really appreciate the opportunity to do it as a whole team. So this is a good model, and we just invite this model for other programs within DTSC. We think it really is helpful for us. We learn more being with you while you're doing this. So thank you, Peter. And thank you again, all of you folks who are gathered, wherever you're gathered. Thank you. Okay, I think,
You need a
are
motion.
Pardon?
You need a motion.
I know. Is there anything else? Do we have any other board concerns before? Does anyone want to move to adjourn this meeting? Sushma, is there a second? Okay, raise your hands if you're all good with it. Do we have a unanimous adjournment? Okay, the board meeting is officially adjourned. Thank you for everybody on Zoom and everyone, the massive audience that we had here today. It was just really heartening. Thank you very much.
And
Bye-bye.
thanks to our
Thank you so much.
Our translators,
Board meeting is officially
our
adjourned at
CSUS
25
team,
p.m.
staff, thank you.